Good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Economy, the Budget, and You. My name is David Chasen, and principal of 2020 Vision, one of the co-hosts of this forum. 2020 Vision and the Concord Coalition would like to thank you all for being here tonight. To the candidates that have agreed to participate in this important discussion on economic and fiscal policy issues, and of course, a big thank you to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics for allowing us to use this wonderful space on the campus of Saint Anselm College. If you're unfamiliar with 2020 Vision, it is an economic policy research and advocacy organization working with legislators, academics, public interest groups, and progressive organizations. The Concord Coalition is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization that educates on the importance of generationally responsible federal fiscal policy. As an aside, neither organization is endorsing candidates participating in this event, nor any others in the primary election. Tonight, two Democratic presidential candidates will participate in one-on-one conversations with moderator Scott Horsley, beginning with former Congressman John Delaney of Maryland, followed by Congressman Tim Ryan of Ohio. A couple of quick comments on logistics. There will be only a few minutes between each 25-minute interview, and this event is being recorded for broadcast, so we just ask that you be respectful of each candidate and save applause until the end of each interview so that candidates get to speak as much as possible. Many of you have submitted questions for the candidates to the moderator online, but if anyone else would like to submit a question before an interview begins, you are welcome to write it on the note card that I think you got at registration and hand it to Chase Hageman of Concord Coalition over there.
If you have any prepared now, I'm happy to grab it. Sorry.
So before we begin, I would like to introduce our moderator, National Public Radio's Chief Economic Correspondent, Scott Horsley. Scott, thank you. Scott currently reports on the ups and downs of the national economy. He spent a decade covering the White House during both the Trump and Obama administrations. Before that, he was a San Diego-based business reporter for NPR, and he reported from the Pentagon during the early phases of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Before joining NPR in 2001, Scott worked for NPR member stations in San Diego and Tampa, as well as commercial radio stations in Boston and nearby Concord, New Hampshire. So welcome back. Scott has a bachelor's degree from Harvard and an MBA from San Diego State University. Thank you very much, Scott, for taking part in this event, and I will hand the show over to you for now, and hope you all enjoy the economy, the budget, and you. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you so much. I spent 3 years working at WKXL in Concord and somehow managed to miss ever being here for a New Hampshire primary, which is not easy to do. So it's great to be back in the Granite State, and great to have Congressman Delaney with us. Thank you so much for being here, and let me just give you a couple of minutes to introduce yourself, say a few words, and we'll jump right in.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me in this historic place of so many great political moments. It's really an honor to be here. So I'm John Delaney. I am running for president. I was born in New Jersey. I grew up in a blue-collar family. My dad was an electrician. I was the first in my family to go to college. My dad was a union electrician, a member of the IBEW, which gave me a great start in life in many ways because that union took good care of us. I went to college at Columbia University. Half of my tuition was actually paid for by my dad's union, which has always been a reminder to me that none of us do it alone in this world. After Columbia, I went to Georgetown for law school, where the best thing that could have ever happened to me happened. I met my wife, April. She was at law school with me. She's from Idaho. Her dad was a potato farmer. We ended up staying in the DC area, raising our family. We have 4 daughters. My oldest is getting married in a month, which I'm very excited about. April's had an amazing career. She's one of the leading nonprofit communications attorneys in the country. She helped found an organization called Common Sense Media, which deals with media literacy in children. And her particular focus is the effect that media and technology companies are having on young kids. I became an entrepreneur. After law school, I started 2 businesses. Fortunately, they were successful. I was the youngest CEO in the history of the New York Stock Exchange when I was 33, and I took my first company public. And about 10 years ago, I decided to dedicate the rest of my life to public service, which led me to run for Congress. And I was elected in 2012 to represent Maryland's 6th congressional district in the Congress, where I proudly served for 6 years, and I was consistently ranked one of the most bipartisan members of Congress. So a blue-collar kid who had a successful career as an entrepreneur, and then public servant. And so my campaign in many ways is reflective of the life I've lived. I believe in the life I've lived, which is this notion of the American dream, which is that we have to make sure young people have opportunities. And that's one of the things that's getting much more difficult in our society today. In fact, young people today will be the first generation of Americans who don't do better than their parents. You can imagine that. And I think it's terrible. And I think it's because we failed in our most fundamental responsibility, which is to leave the world better than we found it. We're not doing that now. We're not leaving these young people kind of an economic future that they deserve. We're not giving them an environmental future that they deserve, and we're not leaving them a fiscal future that they deserve. The good news is we can fix all of it. This is a magnificent country. We have every advantage any nation could possibly want to have in 2019, except for one thing. Our political system is broken, and it doesn't do anything anymore. The world has changed so profoundly over the last several decades because of technological innovation and globalization. Things that have been extraordinarily positive, lifted billions of human beings out of poverty, given us innovations that none of us could ever imagine. But they've also caused huge parts of our country to be left behind. And that's not only hurt them, but it's destabilized our political system here, and it's destabilizing the world because the United States isn't leading anymore. And that's why what I don't believe the American people need any more of is partisanship, ideology, or gridlock. What they need is real solutions to the economic issues that this country is facing and the opportunities. I think there's a whole new economic and technological future coming at us, and we need a president who actually wants to solve those problems and build that better future for all Americans.
Let's talk a little bit about that economic future. And I want to start with the fiscal future that you made reference to. Just yesterday, the bean counters at the Congressional Budget Office came out with their 10-year forecast. Yep. It's not good. It says we're going to be running a $960 billion deficit this year. The deficit will top $1 trillion in each of the next 10 years, and by the end of the next decade, we'll have an outstanding debt that's roughly the same size as our total economy. How big a problem is that?
Well, I think it's a very significant problem, and the problem will present itself when interest rates go up, which they ultimately will. No one knows when or what event will trigger it, but it will happen. And then the interest expense, which is now roughly 6 or 7% of our budget, will start gobbling up a lot of our budget. I think if interest rates were at the levels they were during President Clinton's administration, then interest would be 20% of our budget, and now it's 6 or 7. So that'll ultimately happen again. And so that's why we need a president who cares about this. And I think a comfortable level of debt as a percentage of our economy is, call it 60 to 70%. That's manageable. I think to get it back there, we need more revenues, and we need to fix healthcare, because healthcare is the biggest driver of the fiscal health of this nation.
We'll come back to healthcare, but we've been hearing warnings about interest rates going up since really the beginning of this decade, and in fact they've been going in the other direction. The CBO said yesterday that interest rate, they've reduced their forecast for interest rates. Yep. Otherwise the debt picture would be even worse. Do you think something fundamentally has changed in the global debt market, that we're looking at a period of permanently lower interest rates, or do you think this has just been kind of an aberration that we've been living in for the last?
I think in 100 years when they look back, they'll view this era as an anomaly. But I think there's reasons for it. Part of it is how much development we've had around the world, and so many countries are effectively been net savers, and there's been a lot of liquidity in the world. I think that'll change. I think as these countries start having to build their own social safety nets, which many of them haven't done to the extent we have, that will take kind of global savings out of the global economy and will ultimately return to a normalized interest rate level. I mean, things always return to the trend line, despite people's views that this time is different. They always return to the trend line, and I think interest rates will as well.
You said we have to boost revenues. Where?
Well, you know, the best way obviously to boost revenues is to have higher economic growth. But I also think, in my judgment at least, we've got a couple of big loopholes in our tax code. One is capital gains rates being lower than ordinary income rates. There's no justification for that in my opinion, none at all. It's been a big myth perpetrated on the American people that wealthy people will only invest if their capital gains rates are lower than ordinary income rates. That's absurd. I mean, wealthy people, what are they going to keep their money in the bank, earning very low interest rates? Because their tax rates are 30-something% instead of 20. And I just think there's a huge amount of leakage because that's one area. I think things like that we have to address. We're going to need more revenues.
Let's talk about healthcare. You said you want to fix what's broken, but not scrap what's working.
Yeah, that's
What falls into those two baskets?
Well, I think what's working is Medicare in general. So, you know, I would like to create a form of universal healthcare system in this country where every American has healthcare as a basic right. I think it is a human right. I also think it's smart economic policy. I don't think a lot of people are pursuing their kind of highest and best career opportunities because of healthcare. I only started my first business, which ended up creating thousands of jobs, because my wife was working and she had healthcare. And we were having our first child. I would have never left my job to start a company if we didn't have some kind of healthcare coverage. So I think those stories exist everywhere. But I don't think the way to create universal healthcare is to cause upheaval and throw out the entire U.S. healthcare system. I mean, I think that's a terrible idea. So what I would do as president, in my first 100 days, I'd want to fix the Affordable Care Act. And there are things to do to fix the Affordable Care Act. Then I'd want to create a form of public option, because I actually think that would be a good idea. But ultimately, I want to build a universal healthcare system. And the way I see that working with my plan, which is called Better Care, is I leave Medicare alone. I give everyone else a basic government plan from when they're born to they're 65, and then they go to Medicare. I roll Medicaid into that, because Medicaid's a really broken program. But you allow people the option of opting out of the federal plan. If they opt out, they get a tax credit. They can use that tax credit to buy their own individual insurance. They can give it to their employer to contribute towards employee-sponsored healthcare, or they can give it to their union as part of the union-sponsored healthcare. And I pay for that plan by eliminating the corporate deductibility of healthcare, which is a big loophole. But corporations would still provide healthcare, in my judgment, to their employees, and they would just collect the tax credits from their employees to do it. That's how I would build a universal healthcare system. That's going to take a long time, because you have to have a national conversation and get, you know, the American people on board. So initially, I'd fix the Affordable Care Act, but then I would move towards that. But I would not move to a single-payer healthcare system. I think that's bad healthcare policy. It's terrible politics, but it's also bad healthcare policy.
When the public option was proposed as part of the initial debate over the ACA, the concern from the private insurers was that somehow the government will have these advantages, they'll make market share, it won't be a level playing field. Do you think over time people would migrate to the public option, that market share would grow?
Yeah, I think the way, you know, in some ways Medicare is a very well-designed program. And that's one of the problems I have with this Medicare for All bill, is it actually doesn't even represent what Medicare is. If you think about what Medicare is, you get a basic government plan, which you can then have as your primary health insurance. Or you can buy supplemental plans, which is private insurance that enhances your Medicare. Or you can opt out of Medicare entirely and choose something called Medicare Advantage, which is private insurance. And so Medicare beneficiaries actually have a lot of options. And government insurance and private insurance coexist quite successfully. And that's how I think the whole healthcare marketplace should evolve. Because I think there's a, you know, even in a world where you have a federal healthcare plan, there's always going to be a need for supplementals. And I think most insurance companies actually view the Medicare Advantage business as one of their most successful businesses. So I think you could have these things coexist. And you have to, because the problem with Medicare is it doesn't cover the cost of healthcare. So if you only had a government-run system, healthcare would fundamentally be underinvested in.
What about those costs? You said we got to get a handle on costs in the healthcare system. How do you do that?
So I think creating a universal healthcare system actually does do that in some ways. Because right now we actually
Takes care of the uncompensated people.
Well, that's right, because we have universal healthcare now. It's called the emergency room care. It's just the dumbest kind of universal healthcare. So it gets people covered. We have to create incentives for people to take better care of themselves. We have to create incentives for providers to manage outcomes. And we fundamentally have to cure diseases. Unless we cure Alzheimer's, for example, I mean, we're never going to get healthcare costs under control. Putting aside the havoc and the tragedy of human beings that are associated with this. Same thing with cancer. But here I'm an optimist, which is also why I don't think we should have upheaval in the system. I think we're at the threshold of extraordinary breakthroughs in medical innovation. And it's not because our scientists or investigators are smarter than they used to be, but they have more tools at their disposal in terms of computing power and big data. And so I think if we had a president who actually cared about investing in basic research, we could really be seizing an extraordinary opportunity to make real advances in life sciences that could actually cure some of the most expensive diseases in this country.
You know, there are lots of parts of our economy where innovation does lead to cheaper, more efficient ways.
Always does.
It brings costs down. But in medicine, it really hasn't worked that way. All the innovation we've added, it's just, the cost is just ramped up. In the end, are we going to have less compensation for drug companies, doctors, hospitals?
Well, I think innovation probably has lowered costs, but what it's also done is improved quality a lot. So we could have 1950s cost health care, but we have 1950s quality health care, which no one wants. I mean, there are children who are born now who, if they were born 30, 40 years ago, the condition would be terminal, and now they can live healthy lives. That comes with a cost. The pharmaceutical, I think you touched on a couple things there. I think we have to manage outcomes better. We have to create good incentives for people to do things that I actually think are in their best interest and also lower costs. Pharmaceutical prices, that's in many ways a whole different issue. I think the problem with pharmaceutical prices is not just that the government doesn't negotiate the prices with Medicare, which they clearly should, but there's a bigger problem, in my opinion, and the bigger problem is the whole world is free riding on us. Meaning, if you break the world down into two types of countries, wealthy countries and poor countries, I think poor countries should pay much less for pharmaceuticals because they can't afford it. But if you look at the other wealthy countries, let's say you take the G20, and you compare what they pay for drugs to what we pay, they pay a lot less than we do. Sometimes in like Germany and Spain, they're paying a third of what we pay for the same drugs. And in some cases, they're paying less than cost. And so in reality, this global industry, which is the pharmaceutical industry, these companies are global, they sell their stuff globally, they innovate globally. The US consumer is really subsidizing the whole industry, and that's got to change. We have to have a president that wants to either put in place some type of global pricing cooperative, or actually make this a trade issue. Because I don't think, and that may involve over time some prices going up in some other countries for them to go down here. Because I think pharmaceutical companies need to make a fair profit. Otherwise they won't invest in innovation, that's clear. It shouldn't be excessive, but it should be the kind of profit that encourages investments in innovation. But I don't think they should make all of that profit in the United States of America, which is what they do now. And unless we get at that issue, we're not going to deal with drug costs. And I have an innovative plan to deal with that, which is somewhat controversial, and it probably will never happen, but it makes the point. What I would do is I would create a new tax, and the tax is equal to 100% of the difference between where a pharmaceutical company sells a drug here and where they sell it in the G20. So if they sell a drug there for 30 bucks and here for 100, they've got to pay 100% of $70. And they're like, well, that's crazy, you're taking all my profit. I'm like, well, maybe it should be 65 there and 65 here. Then the tax is zero. But I put that out there to make the point of what we actually have to do to get drug prices down here.
I want to take a quick run through Social Security. You have advocated a commission to explore fixes. We've had a couple of commissions. I think we know what kind of the ingredient lists are, what the checklist is of things. Talk about some of the fixes you would support if they came out of a commission like that.
So I raised the cap.
The cap on income that's taxable for Social Security right now, it's 130 some odd.
Yeah, I would raise that. I wouldn't live
entirely.
No, I wouldn't take it off entirely. I don't think you have to do that, but I would raise it. And I would change the way we calculate the growth of expenses.
Something like a change CPI or like a CPI for the elderly, or
something like a change CPI.
So it's a generally speaking, a slightly smaller cost of living adjustment.
So I think if you do those things, it'll have, first of all, they don't have to kick in for like a dozen years, if not longer. You'll sustain Social Security for 75. What I'm not in favor of, even though I was originally until I started looking at it, is raising the retirement age. Not that I'm not in favor of raising it if we got it right, but the problem is poor people are not living longer, they're living less. And so if you raise the retirement age, you basically are saying to poor Americans, they're never going to get Social Security. Because in reality, if you could figure out a way to do this, you wouldn't have a retirement age, you'd have years worked. Because unfortunately, a lot of poor people enter the workforce when they're 16, 17, and they do manual labor their whole life. And then other people get all kinds of great educations, advanced degrees, and they enter the workforce when they're 27, 28. And those people basically should retire differently. And you have to make sure the Social Security system addresses that. And I think sometimes just blanket increases the retirement age are insensitive to that issue. So I could be convinced of raising the retirement age, but I would have to be convinced that that issue that I just highlighted did not discriminate against, low-income people who do manual labor, who should retire and have access to Social Security at a younger age.
On trade, you have endorsed getting back into the TPP.
I'm the only candidate.
Not a popular position in the Democratic Party right now. But clearly, the other 11 countries have moved on.
They have.
Our farmers are now at a disadvantage trying to sell beef in Japan compared to Australians or New Zealand. How do you sell the TPP to a skeptical Democratic and in many cases general election audience?
Well, I think the nice thing about selling it now, we're selling it in 2016, is back then we had to describe kind of the counterfactual, and now we see it. Right? We see what a trade war looks like, and we see that it's not good. And we see that it's hurting farmers, it's hurting American workers, and it's hurting our geopolitical standing. And in many ways, Trump's isolationism, which I think is the wrong answer to every single question, it presents itself in a lot of different ways. Questioning NATO, tearing up the Paris Accord, proposing to build walls on our southern border. And tearing up the TPP in many ways is another flavor of that isolationism. And I think the Democratic Party wants to reject that. They want to reject building physical walls to keep immigrants out, and we're right to reject that. But we also should reject building economic walls to keep rules-based trade out. And in many ways, they're not the same, but it does reflect a mindset, which is, do you actually think the world is safer and more prosperous for the American people if we're engaging globally? If you think the answer to that question is yes, which I absolutely do, then you have to build economic alliances like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's the only way to deal with China, to compete with them in Asia. And I just think it's never been more important to a U.S. citizen what happens around the world, whether it's pandemics, whether it's the migration crisis that we're clearly going to have, whether it's actually trying to lead the world in climate. All of this involves having alliances and working through those alliances for peace and security around the world. And I think TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, stands for that. And I think if you reject it, you actually have nothing to say against Donald Trump. I mean, one of my competitors, I won't name names here, put forth a trade plan 2 weeks ago. And in it basically was so restricted that we would not be able to enter into a trade agreement with Germany. Because it says, the U.S. will not enter into trade agreements with countries that have any subsidies for fossil fuels. Now that sounds like a good line in a Democratic primary. First of all, the U.S. wouldn't meet that standard. Secondly, Germany that gets 35% of its natural gas from Russia, 35% of its energy comes from Russia, and that they're vulnerable because of that, wants to wean off that, and is providing natural gas subsidies. So our response to Germany wanting to wean off a reliance on Russian natural gas is to say, no trade agreement with the United States. This is just terrible policy, and it's wrong and it's dangerous, in my opinion.
We only have a few minutes left, but you come out of the business world. This week, some of the CEOs of the biggest businesses in the country put out a statement saying corporate America should put aside this notion that Milton Friedman popularized, that the only responsibility of corporate America or the business world is to maximize profits for shareholders, that they have a responsibility to other stakeholders, to workers, communities, suppliers, customers. Do you agree with that?
I do. You know, when I ran my businesses, and you know, I had several thousand employees, they were public companies, they were always one of the best places to work. I always thought I had three stakeholders. I had my shareholders. Obviously, under Delaware law, I was required to do things that are good for my shareholders. I had communities we operated in, which included our customers, and I had my employees. And I would always ask myself, whenever we were doing something, how does it relate to those three stakeholders? And you have to balance them. It's ultimately good for all three to balance all three at the end of the day. And you know, I do agree with that. Fundamentally,
the role for the government in encouraging that more holistic approach to
I do.
Stakeholder capital.
I do. You know, I think our goal should be to take capitalism, which I think is the greatest innovation and job creation machine ever, and not abandon it, but to make it more just and inclusive. And I think the government, through incentives, through tax incentives, and through creating other social insurance programs like paid family leave, et cetera, actually work hand in hand. I mean, the last debate was in Detroit. And Detroit is a really great city to tell the story of the American economy in many ways, right? Because it was once the second largest city in this country. It was iconic for kind of the industrial heft of the United States of America. Then it lost all that. But now it's come back. And if you go around Detroit, which I've done, meeting with groups of entrepreneurs, including a group called Entrepreneurs of Color, which are minority entrepreneurs that have been extraordinarily successful, being backed by private and public capital, you see that Detroit is now turning itself around because the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector are working well together. And so I'm all for an approach that gets these stakeholders all working well together. And we can do it.
What do you say when folks on the other side brand that kind of approach as socialism?
Well, but it's not. I mean, this is the myth. To some extent, this debate is silly between capitalism and socialism. Because what is the United States of America? It's actually neither of those things. It's a free market economy with strong social programs. That's what we are. The genius of America, in my opinion, is that we harnessed capitalism, imperfectly sometimes, but in general, harness capitalism by having workers' rights, by allowing unions to exist, by building great public schools, and building public infrastructure. And those two things working together are what produce the outcome. And so I, to some extent, think this debate is kind of silly. We're obviously not a purely capitalistic country if you read what that term means, even though capitalism is alive and well in the United States of America. And we're certainly not going to become a socialist country. So we should actually stop with those labels. We should just get back to what we really are, which is a free market economy, where you make investments, you take risks, you have the benefits of those if they work, you innovate, but then you basically do things to ensure that opportunity is reasonably shared and available to everyone, and that everyone has a shot. And that's really what we are. And that's how I think about it.
John Delaney, thank you very much.
Thank you. Time goes fast. Thank you all for coming. I wish I could have answered questions. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, exactly.
had it on the wrong setting for the mic line, so it was so bad. When I first started, I was like, oh my gosh, this sounds terrible. And that got shut. Do you want me to stop it? Do you want me to stop it? Oh, we're starting up? Okay. Sorry. No, I was like, I'll save some battery.
Yeah, these are.
Hello, everybody. How are you? Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Congressman Tim Ryan, thanks very much for being here. Take a couple minutes to just introduce yourself and we'll dive right in.
You got it. I got a little caught off guard. I had a mint in my mouth and I just chewed it. And you know that moment when you hope no one asks you a question? You have a mint in your mouth? Thank you. It's great to be here. My name is Tim Ryan. I've been a congressman for 17 years in the United States Congress, representing Northeast Ohio. My district includes Youngstown, Kent State, Akron, so I'm in the northeast quadrant. My house is about halfway between Cleveland and Pittsburgh, old kind of Rust Belt area. My wife is Browns fan, and I know you guys have a football team up here, right, in New England? I thought I heard about it. I tease people up here. We have 3 kids. My wife's a first grade school teacher, and we have 3 kids. Mason 16, Bella's 15, and Brady is 5. And so when I started campaigning up here, someone had said, "Did you name your?" Because I'm an old quarterback. He said, "Did you name your kid after Tom Brady?" And I thought very quickly, I'm in New Hampshire, and I looked them dead in the eye and said, absolutely.
That's the kind of straight answer I hope we'll be getting from you.
Yeah.
I want to start with fiscal matters. We got the report from the CBO this week on the long-term outlook for the deficit. It's big, it's getting bigger. It's going to be $1 trillion every year for the next decade or so. One of the things they pointed to in upping their forecast from May is the spending deal, the bipartisan spending deal that Congress approved this summer. Was that a good bill?
It was a necessary bill because we've gotten into this trap of shutting down the government, not paying our, threatening to not lift the debt ceiling and pay our bills. So it was certainly inadequate, I think, on both sides. Whether it was the military side or on the domestic side, non-discretionary side, we got some increases that were desperately needed. But I don't know how long you want me to answer this, but I feel like we can't have these conversations in silos. around the budget, budgetary numbers, until we really start addressing, and I'll just lay it out for a second here, that all of the systems that we're working through right now are broken, right? The healthcare system's broken, the economic system is broken, the criminal justice system is broken, the education system is broken, and so within the context of all of these broken systems is the budget. And we've got to figure out how to make those systems work better, and I have some ideas that we can talk about here on how to get our budget under control, because my real worry now is that we have these trillion-dollar deficits, interest rates are still very low, there's a little room to maybe cut rates a little bit. We're heading towards a recession. I mean, it's not because Donald Trump's president or anything else, it's like, well, we're 11, 12 years in, it's gonna happen. And my real concern is that we don't have the tools we're gonna need to deal with a recession. And so I guess that's a good kind of place to start our conversation.
Let me ask you about one of those systems you mentioned, which is healthcare.
Yeah.
You've talked about making some tweaks to the ACA, but not throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
Just tell me how you would change it.
Well, two things. One, I'm not for us taking people's private health insurance away if they've negotiated benefits. I just don't think I don't think it's good policy. I think it's terrible politics for Democrats to go into the industrial Midwest, heavy union areas, and say, we're gonna take these negotiated benefits. You've given up wages to get really good health care. The world's collapsed around you in many ways, but you have really good health care. Going in and telling them you got a better idea and it's gonna come from Washington, D.C., I don't think is really smart. So, and I'm not for that. My plan would do this. We would drop the Medicare age to 50. We would allow small businesses to buy into the Medicare program. And what Kaiser Permanente has said is that if you take 60 million people between the ages of 50 and 64, they pay out of pocket to get into the Medicare program, so it's completely revenue neutral. They will save 40% on their health care costs. So 60 million Americans who may be underemployed, have lost their job, so on and so forth, will see a 40% reduction. It will extend the life of the Medicare program because you're taking the youngest cohort, you're putting a new group of young people into the Medicare program. And it will be good for private insurance because you're taking out the oldest cohort in the pool, in the insurance pool, because they're going in. So that will reduce costs in the private market, and then let small business people buy in, and anybody else who can't get it, just use Medicare as a public option. We already have a public option. It's the Medicare program, so allow people to buy into it.
That would be your public
That-
option, or would you also have a separate public option?
I think that could be the public option. We may have to set something else up, but I think for our goals here, you can get into. Everyone in America should have something to get into. Now, that's the insurance piece. Here's the kicker. That's the insurance piece. This discussion is inadequate because the vast majority of our conversation needs to be around health. 3/4 of our healthcare costs are for chronic diseases that are largely preventable, about $3.5 trillion a year. So what I would do is move to a system where we start talking about reversing chronic disease, using food as medicine, incentivizing doctors and patients by getting doctors to get paid by getting and keeping us healthy, give rebates and refunds to patients for getting and staying healthy, and some plans are already starting to move in this direction. But one quick example, you look at these chronic diseases, heart disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes. Right now, almost half of the adult population in the United States has either diabetes or pre-diabetes. So that health insurance conversation we're having, single payer, this, that, everything we're all fighting about, it doesn't matter if half the country has diabetes. You're gonna sink whatever system you have. I think we should, especially as Democrat, I want us to be focusing on getting healthy. So it costs $14,000 a year for a diabetic, type 2 diabetic patient, $14,000 a year. There are plans out there now and programs where for a $5,000, say $10,000, $5,000 to $10,000 intervention using food as medicine and using other supports, you can reverse type 2 diabetes for a one-time $5,000 or $10,000 intervention versus $14,000 a year. I'm saying, why wouldn't we start doing that with all of these patients who have diabetes or pre-diabetes? So $3.5 trillion that can potentially at least make a huge dent in savings. You want to talk about balancing the budget? That's where the money is. And I want my party to be the party saying, this is how we're going to fix it, this is how we're going to pay down the debt, this is how we're going to free up money for all of these other programs that we have by going to where the money is.
And when you say there's a lot of money wasted, for example, in Medicare, is that what you're talking about, is those untreated chronic diseases?
Yeah, it's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it's private insurance as well, it's also in the VA. I mean, here's the kicker, and this is why I think the whole conversation has to be about the systems, right? So we got to look at what our food system looks like. I mean, our food system is causing a vast majority, it's food and stress really is what's making us sick. And so we've got to address the food system. So again, the systems aren't siloed. So we need to do a couple things. One, we need to move to regenerative agriculture so we get the pesticides and the herbicides and all the stuff that's harming our food and destroying our planet, by the way, which is a whole other topic. But also, what are we feeding our kids in schools? So you have kids in poor schools and you're feeding them nothing but sugar. I was in a school last year, they had, for breakfast, they had Rice Krispie treat and chocolate milk. Right? They had 80 grams of sugar before these kids even walked into the classroom. Okay? And those same kids, and I know in the school district that I was in, those same kids are covered by the Medicaid program. So here you're going to feed these kids sugar, you're going to basically give them diabetes, and then you're going to cover them with health care. So you're paying for the school lunch, and you're paying for the health care, and you're giving them diabetes in the middle so the health care costs go up, and you wonder why the American taxpayer's like, you're the dumbest human beings in the world. What are you doing? And then you're going to come back to me and ask me to pay more in taxes. I'm saying let's fix these systems and get them moving in the right direction. But you got to see them holistically.
Well, let's turn to the economy writ large. One of the things you've talked about is immigration reform could boost GDP by 1.2, 1.3%.
Yeah.
What does immigration reform look like to you?
Well, I mean, ideally some version of the bill in the Senate that got 70-some votes. 2013, there's a gang of
Combination of border security, path to citizenship.
This is not rocket science. I mean, it really isn't. It's about building the political coalition to be able to do this. It's a pathway to citizenship. It's pay back taxes, pay a fine, figure out how to, 5, 6, 7 years, get people into the country. It's about border security, using the latest technologies that we need. Not necessarily, I don't know how you build a wall on the Rio Grande River, so that doesn't even make any sense for like large swaths of the country. If it makes sense to have barriers, I'm all for it, but people are digging underneath it, and it's not working like people thought. Pathway to citizenship, go to Central America and try to plug the hole where it's the problem is. The president's cutting the State Department budget, and we need to be intervening in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to stabilize those countries. We don't need to rebuild them, we need to stabilize them to the point where the gangs aren't running them, so people aren't coming here to the United States, but have an open-hearted immigration policy here in the United States.
And where does the economic boost come from? How does that help you?
Well, all of a sudden you get people that were in the shadows making money under the table are now in the system paying into all of the programs, paying the taxes, paying into the programs, and they're going to see higher wages. And so they're going to be putting more money back into the economy. My understanding is that's where you get your 1.2, 1.3% boost. And so to me, it makes great sense, not just people who are kind of working in factories or in the fields, making more justice for them, because you can really get treated poorly if you're not in the light of day. But also the economic opportunities we're missing with people who are graduating from some of our finest universities from countries all over the world, and they graduate and they have to leave. And it's not just Harvard, and it's not just the Northeast. In Pittsburgh, for example, we did a roundtable around immigration a couple years ago. And one of the conversation around the tech companies in Pittsburgh was immigration. It was the #1 issue that kept coming up, because graduates were graduating from Carnegie Mellon with a PhD, They had already started a business, and the business was starting to like go to the next level. They were trying to pull in capital and all the rest. Guy has to go pick up and go back to China or go back to wherever. We heard a story from somebody of the flex screen on the one phone. There's like a flex screen. It was a Chinese person in school at Stanford, I think, in California, developing this company, wanted to do it in the United States, couldn't stay after he got out of school, went to China, ended up getting bought by Samsung or somebody like that, I think it was Samsung, billion-dollar company. Could have been in America. So we've got to be really smart with our immigration policies and how we build out these growing opportunities.
Let me ask about domestic investment. I thought it was interesting when I was covering the White House in the early Obama years when the Recovery Act was put in place.
Yeah.
And one of the things then Vice President Biden said was, we're not going to put any of this money in swimming pools. I think he was trying to offer some sort of reassurance that this wasn't going to be boondoggle spending or something. But I remember thinking at the time that was kind of an odd thing to rule out because the CCC in the Depression built a lot of swimming pools, including in my
I'm sitting here thinking,
dad's
I wish we
hometown.
would have done swimming pools. I mean,
Well, your domestic investment plan does call for pools and playgrounds
Yeah.
and renovating old movie theaters
Yeah.
or old historic
yeah.
downtown.
You've been following me. I like this. This is good.
Well, so what, I'm curious, like, what do those things kind of have in common? What do those mean to a community that you think they're worthy of federal investment?
Well, I'll tell you, I come from Youngstown, Ohio, which is, old steel town. 17 years ago when I got in Congress, my whole vision was, I grew up here. We've been losing jobs since the late 70s, a lot of old manufacturing. My mindset is, how am I going to help rebuild this community and the other smaller communities that I represent? And it was, how do we get in front of growing industries, like growing sectors of the economy, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, energy, advanced manufacturing, AI. So I ended up working my way on the Appropriations Committee, and back when we had earmarks, and we could bring money back. And so I brought hundreds of millions of dollars back for the tech piece, right? And we got one of the best business software incubators in the world is in Youngstown, Ohio. We have Obama's first Innovation Institute around manufacturing. The first one is around additive manufacturing and 3D printing. It went to Youngstown, Ohio. We were able to get it in Youngstown. Doing some great stuff in Akron, Kent, around polymers. Old Akron used to be the old tire capital. So we said, okay, polymers is our strength. At Kent, it was liquid crystal. So how do we build the Liquid Crystal Institute? So anyway, my mindset was like, okay, what do we have? What are our assets? How do we build them up? Now, you also have to have, if you're going to keep your young people in your community, you've got to have quality of life. And so I started bringing money back for bike trails and river walks and amphitheaters and renovating museums and trying to renovate theaters. So you have the quality of life piece, housing in the downtown, where you're really knitting the community together, and it's all around the incubator. So you're building the tech piece, and you're building the quality of life piece. And I just think you can't have a robust new economy if you don't rebuild our downtowns. And we should do that all over the country. And it means swimming pools in some of these communities where kids don't have anything to do in the hot summer day, and then they end up getting in trouble, and then we blame them for getting in trouble because they don't have anything to do. Renovate the parks, build up the downtown, urban parks. So there's a way to do all this, and it's a pittance. It's a pittance in what that would do to small communities to give them an opportunity to revitalize themselves. And so to me, that's a big part of the agenda. Someone said, I was doing the Wall Street Journal editorial board last week, and it's the Wall Street Journal, and they looked at me, they're like, you really think? I was like, okay, what's in a second? That renovating theaters is somehow going to help build the local economy up? And I said, absolutely I do. How are you going to retain talent? If you don't have, you could have the best tech job in the world. No one's going to move to a town that has nothing to do. Trying to recruit 25, 30-year-old tech workers or young families, you better have cool stuff going on. And it's happening. It's just not happening near enough.
So quality of life, especially for young people, educated people. At the other end, you talked about wage insurance for people in the later years of their career. Tell me about that.
So I have a plan called the Worker Act, So we lost a lot of steel workers, still are. We lost an auto plant, General Motors auto plant that had, at one point had 16,000 workers. When President Trump got in, it had 4, now it's idle. There was a supplier, Delphi, to that to General Motors. They had about 13,000 people gone. We've just seen this erosion over the last 40 years. So one of the things is, how do you get people from that job that's paying you maybe 30, 40 bucks an hour, and then none of the jobs around town nearly can replace that. So you're down to 15 or 20 bucks an hour, if you're lucky. So my plan is, how do you give them wage insurance from the transition to help smooth that transition over so you can keep your house, keep your car, keep your family together, while you're getting trained for something else. So you're already working another job, and you're already probably going to get retrained. So let's use some wage insurance for a year or two until you get in and help them pay for the training at the community college, or if they're joining a union or apprenticeship or certification or whatever it may be. How do you smooth that transition over?
But it's a transitional thing, it's not till retirement.
No, it's not. No, it's you know, obviously we'd have. I'm on House of Representatives guy. It's like you sit down with the committees, you work out the details. But yeah, for me it would be a transitional thing while you're making investments. So one of the things Ro Khanna, who's the congressman from Silicon Valley, and I did, we got 13 venture capitalists on a bus. This is one of my better ideas, I must say, if I do say so myself. Another humble politician walking through New Hampshire, right? But to get these venture capitalists, 80% of venture capital is in 3 states. It's in California, it's in Massachusetts, and it's in New York. And so I've always said, look, the government can't do everything. They can't. We got to work with the private sector, right? So our problem in Youngstown and Akron is we don't have private investment. So we brought these guys, got them on a bus, and we took them from Youngstown to Akron to Detroit to Flint, Michigan, and South Bend, Indiana. We went over to see Mayor Pete. And it was about, how do you get private sector investment into these communities? And wouldn't you know, just by them seeing it, they started seeing opportunities for things that in the Midwest, industrial Midwest, our entrepreneurs were thinking about that people in Silicon Valley weren't thinking about. So all of a sudden in their mind it was like, wait a minute, maybe there are opportunities in the Midwest. And so as president, I want to use the Department of Commerce to really break down those barriers. Get that 80% venture capital into these communities. Again, you're building them up, you have the incubators, you have the technology, you're building the quality of life. Now here comes the private sector, hopefully to really jazz things up.
Quick audience question. This is what Suzanne Schell wanted to know about how you address the high cost of housing, which is obviously a concern in New Hampshire and in much of the country. I'm curious, is that a federal responsibility? And also in Youngstown and Akron, it's maybe the opposite concern, right? Housing costs that maybe aren't appreciating as much as you'd like to see them.
Yes, yeah, we have very low housing costs. You'll have a few neighborhoods that pop up when the economy gets good, but then we're still recovering from the subprime mortgage crisis that we had in Ohio. It was brutal, wiped us out, and we're still recovering. 2 things in those communities. We've got to have a robust plan to take out the dilapidated homes that are driving down everybody's housing costs. Clean the blight out. It's drugs, it's this, it's that. No one's taking care of it. So we got to get rid of those. And my big vision is to put in robust urban agriculture and have summer jobs for kids, have after-school jobs. And you start getting healthy food into the communities as well. That's what I'm saying. These systems aren't isolated. So how do you build everything out? Now you have urban ag. For the affordability issue, which is an issue, we have, it's amazing what's happening. The 10 cities in LA, many of you probably have read articles about, people just can't afford their homes. It's pretty much 2 things. You need a robust low-income tax credit. That's the one thing you've got to double, triple, quadruple. We got to create hundreds and hundreds of thousands of affordable homes. And you can do that by giving the developers a low-income tax credit that is significant to get the gap so that they can make money, but you can also provide affordable housing. And the other piece is really local. The local state, the local city, town, whatever, has got to make it welcoming for affordable housing to come in. But the main thing and I do think it's a federal responsibility because it's a federal problem. It's a national issue.
You started out by saying we are going to go into a recession at some point, and not because of this administration's doing, but just by expansion, getting kind of long in the tooth. Do you think we're going to enter a recession pretty soon? How do you think the economy's doing right now?
I just tend to think it is. I mean, it's just the longevity of the expansion. It's math. I mean, it's gonna happen at some point. We're starting to see manufacturing, just in the last day or two, report came out. Manufacturing is contracting. That's kind of a canary in the coal mine. The inverted yield curve that everybody in America knows about now, that didn't know about 6 months ago.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago. You know, is signaling a recession. And again, my concern really is that we're going to go into this recession with very few tools. I mean, we have gotten so far away. When I went to college, you learn about Keynesian economics, and it just made so much sense for so long, right? You repair the roof, you know, when the sun's shining, and we have the highest concentration of wealth we've ever had. We have CEOs who are making 940% more than they were making in 1978. And we just are going through this huge expansion, and they're doing really, really well, and we're 2 wars, and we didn't ask anybody to pay more in taxes from the wealthy. And so now we get, in fact, the opposite, right? A tax cut that's gonna cost $2.3 trillion once you pay it back over 10 years. And we have $1 trillion a year deficits. So what are we gonna do when we go into a recession, right? You either gotta spend some money. I mean, if you look at how we've always gotten out of this, right? I mean, people say, President Kennedy wanted a tax cut. How come you Democrats aren't like President Kennedy? He wanted a tax cut. Kennedy wanted a tax cut because there was a recession coming. They were increasing spending a little bit in defense, and NASA was the public spending, and then cut taxes to get money in the economy. And then when the economy goes up, you raise taxes so you capture some money when times are good. You modestly reduce spending, and you bring it into balance. And we're trapped now. So it's going to be, the next president's going to have a really tough job.
Just briefly in our last minute, you're a Midwestern guy.
Yeah.
Where are you on trade and tariffs and some of the trade battles the president's been fighting?
I admit that I liked how President Trump, when he started, to be very clear, when this started, that he was going to be very firm with China. China has been cheating. They do steal intellectual property. They do have industrial espionage. They do subsidize their company. I can name you how many steel companies from Youngstown, Ohio that went out of business over the last 20 years because China was subsidizing their steel, manipulating their currency. And so I like the firmness, and then make a deal. He wants to make this a news story. He wants to look tough in the industrial Midwest like he's tough on China. And I will say that I like the firmness, but then you make a deal. Now you're dragging the farmers through this, you're dragging them through. We're seeing the consumers are paying $1,000 more a year because of the tariffs. And if I could just say lastly, you beat China by outcompeting them. China dominates 40 to 50% of the electric vehicle market now, 60% of the solar panel market. They're running circles around us with 5th generation internet. You want to beat China, you outcompete China. And that means, one of the things I'm going to do is create a chief manufacturing officer, because I want us to start building things again. And I know we're not bringing the steel mills back, but I want us to build electric vehicles. There's going to be 10 million built in the next 10 years. I want half of those built in the United States by American workers, batteries built in the United States, solar panels built in the United States. So how do we create a chief manufacturing officer that is in my cabinet, reports directly to me, and we just drive it? That's how you beat China. It's not the silly game he's playing with the trade and tariffs.
Congressman Tim Ryan, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all once again for joining us for Economy, the Budget, and You. A big thank you to our gracious host, New Hampshire Institute of Politics, and to Scott Horsley of NPR for moderating two terrific conversations with presidential candidates John Delaney and Tim Ryan. 2020 Vision and our partner, the Concord Coalition, appreciate you spending some of your evening with us. If you're interested in learning more about either organization or wish to stay up to date on events, please check out our websites, 2020visiondc.org and ConcordCoalition.org. Have a great night, and we hope to see you again in the future. Thanks again, everyone.